Shalom, shalom. I'm gonna get into this video. This is a heavy video right here. All right, going into the housing market and how it was all orchestrated and set up by these devils to this very day. But this comment I want to read real quick before I get into this video. This is a heavy video. You need to watch the whole video. But right here, at the very top, this Jake woman, she says, yet and still people think systematic racism is a hoax. All right, so the so-called average white person, the Edomite, think that, you can pull your own self out. People, they'll say shit like pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. You know what I'm saying? They'll go on these rants talking about how their family had to work out of these, poverty or whatever. That's all bullshit, right? But the average so-called white man and woman don't care, right? They just care about what they got going on. They don't give a damn about your struggle. Because there was a time in this country history you wouldn't even look at it as a whole person, and it's still that way, right? Read this comment again. It says, yet and still people think systematic racism is a hoax. It says, I'm struggling to read this book, How White Folks Got So Rich. I recommend you brothers and you sisters read this book. It's a heavy book. It says the untold story of American white so-called supremacy. All right, so this book is really making my blood boil, right? So you so-called white people think that we're making all this up, right? That this is a figment of our imagination, right? And that's why we call you the devil, because you is the devil. Let me get into this video.
One room or too many families live jammed together. There are the slums.
In 1945, 38-year-old J.D. Shelley and his wife Ethel purchased a modest two-story brick home on Labadie Avenue in north central St. Louis. What they didn't realize is that, by law, they technically weren't allowed to buy that house, even though the previous owner willingly sold it to them, even though they paid the asking price. Because J.D. and his wife Ethel, and each of their 6 children, were all black. What followed would be known as one of the most significant decisions in the history of the United States Supreme Court. But
And let me say this as well. There's no such thing as black people, right? That's a derogatory term that they call you to your face every day.
probably never heard of it. And despite what should have been seen as a sweeping condemnation of racial segregation in housing, that segregation continued through overt fear-mongering of white residents, white flight, a practice known as blockbusting, as well as through overt and covert government actions meant to ensure that white neighborhoods remained white and undesirables were pushed into overcrowded, underfunded industrial neighborhoods in virtually every metropolitan area in the United States. Roll the intro. Thank my partner on today's video, Warby Parker. I got my at-home try-on kit. Calming to try on new identity. You can also get eye exam, your favorite high school art teacher. And these boys are a bit of a... The Shelley family moved from Mississippi to St. Louis in 1930 to escape racial antagonism in the South. J.D. was 23 and had been working as a laborer in sawmills, on railroads, and in construction. By the time the family left, Mississippi, dominated by Jim Crow-era laws, was known for racism, the KKK, and lynchings. In Mississippi alone, nearly 500 black people had been lynched by 1930 when the family packed their bags and decided to leave. Black people in Mississippi were expected to adhere to a strict code of behavior expected to show deference, subservience, and obedience to whites, and any disobedience was grounds for lynching. According to historian Neil R. McMillan, the years from 1889 to 1919 were among the most repressive in Mississippi's history by nearly any measure. The frequency and sadism of lynching and other forms of white vigilantism, the extension and formal codification of black disenfranchisement, segregation and exclusion, the prejudicial character of the criminal justice system, and the prevalence of peonage. It was in this context that J.D. and Ethel Shelley left Mississippi, hoping for better treatment and more safety for their 6 children, children in St. Louis, Missouri. This safety was, of course, relative. Missouri had only experienced 60 reported lynchings compared with Mississippi's 500. But St. Louis still had laws and ordinances that enforced segregation, including bans on interracial marriages and relationships and segregated schools. St. Louis was further segregated not by explicit laws and regulations, but by private residential agreements. The Supreme Court had outlawed racially restrictive ordinances in 1917, meaning cities couldn't overtly bar black people from living in white neighborhoods and vice versa. But that's never stopped racists, has it? Now, they had many other ways of ensuring that neighborhoods remained segregated. One way was by adding what are called restrictive covenants to their deeds when building and selling houses. You learn about restrictive covenants in the first year of your property law class in law school. They are rules that the owner of a property can impose on subsequent owners. Sometimes they're pretty innocuous, like no subsequent owners of this property can plant apple trees anywhere on said property. Those are usually perfectly legal. But racists got clever at the beginning of the 20th century and started adding restrictive covenants to their deeds that said things like, and I quote, "The real property above described, or any portion thereof, shall never be occupied, used, or resided on by any person not of the white or Caucasian race, except in the capacity of a servant or domestic employed thereon as such by a white Caucasian owner, tenant, or occupant." Through the use of these restrictive covenants, owners were able to ensure that subsequent buyers of their property would always be white. The pesky problem with this kind of language in a deed of sale is that it's a private contract between the buyer and the seller. So if the seller wants to sell to a black person and they find a black person willing to buy, even if there's a race-based restrictive covenant, there's nothing that can stop them. A neighbor can't come in and try to enforce the private contract because they're not a party to the contract. So increasingly, entire neighborhoods would come together and enter into private contracts saying that they would never ever sell their houses to black people. That way, all the neighbors who signed on to the contract then had the right to sue if any other neighbor turned around and sold their home to a black person. And they would create the contracts to run with the land, as they say in the biz, meaning that it was binding to the property and to subsequent owners of the property, meaning these racially restrictive agreements were then taken on by subsequent buyers of the same property. This is also the reason why homeowners associations were created, to restrict blacks from entire subdivisions. So there's a fun fact to bring up at your racist Great Aunts barbecue next week. And this practice was pervasive in virtually every major city and suburb in the United States for the first half of the 20th century. And these restrictive covenants were upheld again.
You heard that? You heard that. So it's heavy, man. But y'all people just don't get it. Right? You've been oppressed on every single level that you can imagine. And you so-called white people, that's why they stay in the best neighborhoods, right? Got these big flourishing mansions, right? And they got these jakes in these ghettos, these barrios, right? The hood, right?
And again, by courts across the country as perfectly constitutional because they were private agreements between private parties, not state action against a certain race. And despite the fact that it was acknowledged that government-sanctioned and enforced housing restrictions would be unconstitutional, the government continued to restrict access to housing for Black Americans, especially via the FHA. The Federal Housing Administration was created in 1934 in response to the Great Depression to allow the U.S. government to help fund the purchase of housing, thus creating desperately needed construction jobs and helping people who had been flattened by the Depression get back on their feet and purchase property. The way the FHA worked is by using government funds to ensure private bank mortgages that covered 80% of purchase prices and had terms of 20 years. Because the FHA is the one insuring the mortgage on the house, the FHA then insisted on doing its own appraisal of the property to make sure that the loan had a low risk of default. That's what insurers do. They see whether the risk is high or low, and they prefer to insure lower risk things because then they get to keep their money. And what was in the handbooks and manuals for all FHA insurance appraisal agents? A whites-only restriction. Basically, the FHA, as well as other mortgage insurers, had determined that black homebuyers were too risky. What's more, they determined that even if the homebuyer was white, if the home was located near black neighborhoods or in neighborhoods where black people also resided, it was too risky to insure the mortgage, making the homes impossible to buy, especially for black buyers. Because if the FHA wouldn't insure the mortgage, banks usually wouldn't lend the money to buy the home. And while it's no longer the policy of the FHA to not insure black home buyers, the idea that black home owners and black neighborhoods are inherently poorly kept is an idea that persists to this day. The idea that when black people move in, the neighborhood deteriorates because of some, shortcoming on the part of black people. But let's take a damn step back, okay? Because as with all things, this is a myth that was created by racism and is actually the fault of white supremacy. Let's use St. Louis as an example because that's where our story about the Shelleys takes place. At the beginning of the 1900s, St. Louis city planners deliberately zoned for single-family only homes in white neighborhoods with restrictive covenants, guaranteeing that those neighborhoods would remain intact and whites only. In neighborhoods with predominantly black populations and land near those neighborhoods, they zoned for multifamily homes and industrial development, including polluting industry. Not only that, but the commission permitted taverns, liquor stores, nightclubs, and houses of prostitution to open in African American neighborhoods, but prohibited them in white neighborhoods. They also allowed for the subdivision of properties located in black neighborhoods, but not in white neighborhoods. And in this atmosphere, with black would-be homeowners completely barred from purchasing most homes, black homeowners were pushed into industrial-zoned, polluted locations littered with strip malls and liquor stores. And because they couldn't obtain FHA-insured loans to buy the few homes available to them, they often had to rent out rooms or live together with family members and overcrowd what little housing was available to them. And when those houses inevitably began to break down from overuse, they didn't have the funds to repair the houses, leading to the perception that black people degrade the value of neighborhoods, when in fact, they were simply surviving in the squalor that white supremacy made for them. It was in this reality that the Shelley family attempted to find a home to purchase in St. Louis. They worked with a real estate agent who was recommended to them by their pastor, and he found them a house in a white neighborhood where the seller was willing to sell to them as a black family. They bought the house and moved in. However, unbeknownst to the Shelleys, in 1911, a restrictive covenant was placed on the house between the surrounding houses, and it was still attached to their home. It said, and I quote, "Hereafter, no part of said property or any portion thereof shall be, for said term of 50 years, occupied by any person not of the Caucasian race, it being intended hereby to restrict the use of said property for said period of time against the occupancy as owners or tenants of any portion of said property for resident or other purpose by people of the Negro or Mongolian race." End quote. And then Lewis Kramer, a homeowner whose property was part of the restrictive covenant, sued the Shelleys to evict them from their home and get the court to declare the sale of the home to the Shelleys as a breach of the legally binding restrictive covenant. The Missouri court sided with Kramer, saying that the agreement was between private parties, so it was enforceable. The case wound its way up to the Supreme Court, which was faced with the question, are race-based restrictive covenants constitutional, and can they be enforced by a court of law? The court held that while the race-based restrictive covenants may not necessarily be unconstitutional, because the Constitution applies to state actors, and this was a private agreement between private individuals, so okay, not necessarily unconstitutional. However, they are not legally enforceable by state courts, because by enforcing the covenants, the state courts were taking government or state action to enforce a racially restrictive covenant, and that is unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment, because then it becomes state action when the court enforces it. So the practical effect of this ruling was to make any existing and future racially restrictive covenants unenforceable in court. You can write them, and you can even abide by them privately, but a court isn't going to step in and enforce them if someone subsequently breaks the covenant and sells to a black person. Despite how divided the country was on this issue, this was a unanimous decision by the Supreme Court. Kind of. It was a 6-0 vote. Yes, there are 9 justices on the Supreme Court, and there were in 1948 when this case was decided. But 3 of those 9 justices, 1/3 of them, had to recuse themselves because they lived on property subject to a race-based restrictive covenant. You see, this is back when Supreme Court justices would recuse themselves if they or their families were even tangentially related to the case at hand, such that they could be biased in one way or another, but we've done away with that silly formality. Thanks, Clarence. While this case played out in court, the Shelleys remained in their home at 4600 Labadie Avenue in St. Louis. On the day of the ruling, J.D. Shelley recounts, and I apologize, pretend that this is in a nice southern accent. He said, "When I got home that evening, my wife was sitting on the front porch reading the paper that says we won the case. That night the photographer come and we was sitting on the couch with the kids betwixt us and some on the floor, and they had it in the newspaper. We lived in that house on Labadie for maybe 10 years. I kept on working in construction long as I could, and my kids and their kids were all working too. Right now, I got 5 great-great-grandchildren. Ethel passed on September 15th, 1984. We was married 60 years, and when we had our anniversary, they had a big ceremony over to the church. The way I see it, it was a good thing that we done this case. We was the first ones to live where they said colored couldn't live." 4600 Labadie Avenue is still a private residence in